Hey everyone, welcome to session 306 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Dr. John Guercio returns to the show for his third appearance, bringing his extensive experience and fresh insights into the world of adult services and behavior analysis. In this episode, John discusses the vital and yet often overlooked field of supporting adults with autism and other developmental disabilities, particularly with those with severe behavior challenges. In this podcast, we talk about John's new leadership role at ARC of the Ozarks. We talk about his new course that he developed with colleagues over at the Applied Behavior Analysis Center, which we'll have links to in the show notes. And that is an adult-specific RBT training program, which sounds really exciting. We talk about his latest book on staff training in adult services settings and key findings from his recent research on enhancing data collection in residential facilities. And we pretty much spent most of the podcast talking about that. And then we also talk more generally about the systemic and practical challenges of working in group homes. Throughout the conversation, John emphasized the importance of dignity, choice, and inclusion, and provided practical strategies for training and retaining staff who work in high-demand settings. Again, as I mentioned a moment ago, we reference tons of resources in this podcast. So you're going to want to go to the website, behavioralobservations.com, and check out the show notes. You can also just sign up for the email list while you're there, and you can get the show notes delivered straight to your inbox. Before we get to the podcast, I want to give a shout out to the people who make this podcast happen, and they are the sponsors of Behavioral Observations. They include Frontera. Consider taking a demo of Frontera's assessment builder and see how the ethical application of AI's technologies can help you serve clients and save you time. Your first assessment report is free, and if you use code BOP25, you'll get an additional 5 assessments for just $100. So head over to fronterahealth.com to check it out. We're also brought to you by HRIC Recruiting. That's right, if you need a job or if you just want to know if the grass is greener on the other side, contact Barbara Voss for a confidential conversation right now over at hricolorado.com. We're also brought to you by Behavior University, whose mission it is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Go over to behavioruniversity.com/observations to find the discount code. Well, actually, it's not a secret. You can just say podcast at checkout, but you're going to want to check out their on-demand webinars, their RBT courses, supervision courses, and much, much more. We're also brought to you by CEUs from yours truly, Behavioral Observations. So if you want to learn on the go while listening to your favorite podcast guests, you can go to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEUs. And last but not least, this is what I'm really excited about for many reasons, including a personal one. It's the inaugural ABA Con CEU Cruise, which launches on Royal Caribbean's Wonder of the Seas from February 16th to the 20th, 2026. So you can learn more about the cruise at goabacon.com. And again, we will talk about it later on in the podcast. I'll be speaking at that event and moderating a panel discussion. It'll be my first cruise. I'm super excited. So I hope to see you there. All right, that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun conversation with Dr. John Guercio.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. John Guercio, thanks for coming back on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. We've been trying to schedule this one for a while, and I'm so glad we finally pinned it down. Thanks for joining me.
Yes, my pleasure, man. So glad to be back.
So this is your third time on the show. The last one, I went and looked it up. It was back in February of 22. We were talking about behavioral relaxation training. So it's been a little bit. I was thinking like, oh my gosh, it's just on, and it's like, no, like time flies, doesn't it?
It's been a while. Yeah, we've run into each other at conferences and had a chance to chat, but it has been a little while.
Yeah. So, and you've been a busy bee.
I have.
And a lot of cool things going on. So I want to talk about the paper that you shared with me, the blending staff preference assessments and contingent reinforcement to enhance data collection in a residential facility for adults with severe aggressive behavior. Very important topic. Before we get into that, though, why don't you just kind of catch us up? What have you been doing in the last couple of years?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. It's been kind of crazy. So the main thing is that I just took on a new position about 6 months ago. So I am now the Vice President of Crisis Services and Applied Behavior Analysis and ABA Services for the Arc of the Ozarks. So the Arc is located down in Springfield, Missouri. And I've been, gosh, for almost the last 20 years or so, been doing deinstitutionalization, moving folks out of psychiatric placements and hospital placements. And the ARC is, like I said, primarily in Kansas City and Springfield areas. And they were looking to expand. And so we'd been having conversations for years. And so finally, we decided to pull the trigger, and I'm here now. We have an office. We're in St. Charles, Missouri, right outside of St. Louis, and essentially we take folks that are have three main criteria. They're either coming out of a psychiatric or a regular hospital due to their behavioral issues have landed in there, jail or some other, maybe a forensic setting, something of that nature, or they're unhoused and behaviorally they don't have a place to go. And so we are setting things up. We've opened up our initial crisis home. We've got a couple of other homes that are on the horizon now, and kind of taking people that, our first young man was, home with dad, and dad had to take out 401k for them to live because he had to quit work to stay home with his son. And so just trying to alleviate those situations. And so right in the middle of that, kind of getting all that staff. And then also in April, my staff training book came out. So that's why it's perfect timing to talk about staff training and adult services, because it's, a little bit of a kind of an adjunct to that paper that you mentioned, kind of looking at how you train staff and, how do you kind of take the science and look at practice, but then also look at the research end of things. So it's really been an active part of my work over the last really year, is getting this information out there about staff training, and how do we do it? It's different from early intervention. And then, I think that the distinctions between early intervention and staff training with adults kind of speak to themselves. But then there's also, with my business partner, Dr. Adrian Fitzer, we also in December rolled out an adult RBT training. So it's specific to adults. It's a 40-hour training, and basically it is with Dr. Natalie Driscoll. She's an Endicott College PhD graduate. I worked with Peter Gerhardt, myself, and Dr. Fitzer, who runs ABAC, the Applied Behavior Analysis Center. She works with the Cambridge Center, and they do a lot of verbal behavior, Cambridge Center Verbal Behavior Conference information, and I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of those things. But we rolled this out in December, I want to say. So now we're kind of tweaking it to get used to the new RBT requirements in 26 that the BACB is rolling out. But essentially, it's a 40-hour digitally based RBT training that's specific, because we were getting many RBTs that were coming to us specifically here and other places, and they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. They had gone through RBT trainings, and no fault of theirs, but most of the RBT trainings that are out there focus on early intervention. And the examples are in early intervention. And the video examples are in early intervention. So our idea was to look at the main differences ethically. What are the ethical components? When you work in early intervention, you're not worried about cigarettes and alcohol, hopefully. So these are things that we're dealing with in this population. So we've gotten a lot of really good feedback. The protocol kind of allows individual BCBA supervisors to go through the training and monitor their supervisees as to progress and kind of what they've gone through. We had a number of our RBTs here at the ARC go through the training as well, to kind of give us some feedback on, okay, based on your experience in the job as you know it, does this fit the bill to get new RBTs ready? Because we were finding that a lot of our RBTs that we would send through existing 40-hour trainings, I had a number of really good direct support staff fail the RBT exam 3 times. And it's because it wasn't their career. So that was our goal as well, to be able to make it to where you go through this. Our hope is that it's a one-time only type thing. You go through this. So there's a workbook, and there's a lot of other materials that are involved to make it competency-based and hands-on. So the goal is when you take the exam, you pass it the first time around to be able to do that. So you're right, a lot of stuff, pretty busy the last year or two.
Are you at BCBA feeling overwhelmed by the time and energy it takes to complete intake assessments for kids with autism? You're not alone. When hours are spent on paperwork instead of providing care, it slows everything down for you and the families counting on you. That's why Frontera exists. Frontera is an AI-driven, HIPAA-compliant platform designed specifically for ABA professionals like you. Built by Amal Deshpande, a seasoned founder and father to a child with autism, Frontera brings together clinicians and engineers to streamline the most time-consuming parts of your job. So what does that actually look like? With Frontera's smart tools like the Assessment Builder and Diagnosis Builder, you can reduce your report writing workload from 8 to 10 hours to just 3 to 4. That's more time for therapy, faster access to services, and less burnout. Visit fronterahealth.com to see how it works. Use code BOP25 at checkout to get 15% off both of our report writing tools. Let Frontera help you work smarter so you can focus on what matters most. I have a couple of questions and comments related to all of that. First of all, what is the title of the book? And just for folks, if you're driving around in your car, or you're walking your dog or whatever, I'll have links to all these resources in the show notes for this episode. But what is it? But for the, just so people can search it if they're, if they don't go to the website, what's the name of the book?
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. So it's Staff Training Manual, and it's staff training strategies for adult service settings.
Okay.
And, it's got the ASHA logo, the Assessment of Adult Core Competencies, which is my curriculum. And this is all bound up within the curriculum. So there's now the curriculum. There is a workbook that goes along with the curriculum. And then this is for the staff training portion. So it was on purpose that we tried to make the book to where it would be, if you're an existing manager or program supervisor, and different places call it, the titles have different names, but you could pick this up, or as a behavior analyst supervisor of RBTs, you could pick this up, and you've got evidence-based staff training procedures that you can use with your staff at the direct support level or at the RBT level, regardless of what your supervisory capacity is.
I see. And then I also can't let a mention of my friend Adrienne Fitzer go by without sharing my, everything that she does is quality. So,
Man,
and I think,
yes.
I haven't seen the curriculum, but I can only imagine that between all of you folks that it is just knocked out of the park here. So, and then I'm not saying I've got I don't have anything to disclose. This is just me wishing my friends and colleagues well. So,
But I want to tag on to that a little bit too. Adrienne is amazing. Her program design mindset and how do we approach this, and then her teaching on this, and she says in the first couple of videos, I've been on the other side of the camera with this for years, and this is kind of what I've been doing, and now she's teaching, and like you said, she knocks it out of the park, and it is so thorough and to the point, and we're taking feedback from folks that have gone through it to kind of say, hey, how do we improve that? And she spends a lot of time getting back to individual practitioners, organizations, and supervisors to, hey, how can we make this better? To refine the product and to make it a better product for them. So absolutely endorse that, and thank Adrienne. She's wonderful. And This has been a great experience. Fantastic.
Yeah, so I'll have links to that and as well, ABAC as well in the show notes for this episode too. So let's kind of get into the subject matter here. I think your point about how the majority of the field is aimed at serving young individuals with autism is spot on. And so I want you to take this opportunity. You're speaking to thousands of behavior analysts right now who might not be familiar with supporting adults in community settings. So I want to give the opportunity to talk about that a little bit and maybe educate the audience on some of the unique challenges to supporting folks, as you say, who come from all these different backgrounds, and a lot of them aren't optimal, to say the least, and especially from the standpoint of where these people live, like in your neck of the woods. It's group homes. Here in New Hampshire, you don't see group homes for adults that frequently. We have a kind of like an adult foster care model, which it works good percentage of the time, but there's still some scenarios where a staffed situation is probably more more effective and appropriate. But there's some unique challenges to supporting adults in community settings. So I'd love to give you the opportunity to kind of run through at least a few of them to bring our listeners up to speed.
Well, I think the first one, and when we go through and I've been doing this and doing presentations at Tex ABA recently, and ABA, usually one of the first slides I include details what are the differences between early intervention and the differences between behavior analysis when it comes to adult settings. And I think the number one thing is dignity. So as we're going through, many times I think behavior analysts, RBTs, they really take it for granted that, if you're taking Joey to the shower and Joey's 35 years old, make sure that he's covered. There's many times where individuals, just going to the bathroom and getting that assistance with showering or whatever, that's very invasive if you have to help out somebody, when they're showering or if they're going through activities of daily living. So that's one big one. The other one is choice. I think that, and unfortunately, I think the field is getting a lot better with it. We're talking more about choice and compassion and all the things in behavior analysis now because of some of our missteps in our long ago history. But choice, that typically when you're working with a child with a feeding issue, or a child with an elopement issue or an aggressive issue, you're better able to physically control and say, no, we're not going to do this. Or mom and dad are the choice makers. Whereas with adults, the adults are the choice makers. Okay, what are we having for dinner tonight? Where are we going to go? Where would you like to go in the community, today? Or, hey, I would like to go to the gentleman's club over here, and be able to go to an adult setting where some staff that's something that they step back from and they don't want to address. Another one that's huge is sexuality, and I don't know, I don't think we talked about it when we talked about the curriculum initially, but sexuality is a really big issue that is, I think, a lightning rod for discussion or arguments within the field because I have many direct support staff, and I've even had administrators at times that say, John, why are you're setting up these folks on dates and we're doing all these other things, and part of our sexuality curriculum is we have discrete, measurable behavioral goals for folks to be able to go in the community and spend a few hours alone with their significant other or an overnight. And a lot of times I get pushback on that. I think I may have mentioned on our first podcast, but I've had guardians tell me, hey, John, if a person has a guardian, they can't have sex. And, that's just not true. I haven't read any Missouri statute or any federal statute that's the case. We have tools that people can make choices and demonstrate competency in those areas. But I think those are the biggest areas. I do want to kind of to give a shout out to Open Future Learning. I have no affiliation with it at all, but Dave Hingsberger, was a very strong advocate for individuals, for adults in group living situations in the community. And he passed away about a year and a half ago. And he's got this Facebook page and also it's a website, Open Future Learning, but it has adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities talking about going to the store and trying to buy alcohol or trying to do certain things that any adult would do and getting pushback on it, and about how sometimes their direct support staff can be very overbearing in their lives. And so it's great. There are a lot of clips that I use, on there. And one recent one that I did, and I know you don't want anything political on here, and neither do I. I'm just going to state it because it's funny. I'm not a cartoon guy, so whenever I do my presentations, I rarely, if ever, put cartoons on there. But Open Future Learning had a great cartoon that was out recently that had a gentleman who may bear resemblance to, to somebody that maybe some people would know, saying, when I was younger, I never saw people with autism. So this is a new entity. This is a new thing that's going on because when I was a kid, folks with autism weren't there. And he's talking to a gentleman, and the gentleman says, well, the reason for that is because they were all over there. And he's pointing on a hill, and it's an institution.
I've seen that, yes.
Yeah. So I think it brings up a really good point, is that I think that a lot of people, you know, at the time, we're looking at it and saying, okay, autism is just a little kid's entity. And they don't respect the fact that no, the prevalence though may have been different due to our diagnostic skills and whatever else, may be going on. But that as we're going through, a lot of these individuals were told, parents were told at 4 and 5, Johnny needs to be at the rehabilitation center or move to an institution. So as a result, there wasn't that strong push. And so a lot of these individuals I now see, and they're only now coming out of the institution, and we're actually providing residential homes for them in the community. But they've always been there, maybe not at the same prevalence level. Some argue that it's possible that our diagnostic skills weren't there yet, but I think that that's one of the big truths about it as well, is that, for every child with autism, give it 15 years and there's an adult with autism. And so those are just the facts. And like I said, I think first time I was here is that I really want to just be able to get the field more prepared. And, myself and Pete Gerhardt and others are doing this wonderful work. Robert LaRue at Rutgers, doing a lot of the vocational work there. So it's a lot of big differences there on how those things are addressed in the clinical skill set, but I still pick up every issue of JABA and I still count, and I can count on 2 fingers the number of adult articles I'm going to see in every JABA or every issue of BAP. And hopefully that changes. I mean, it's a slow process, I think, to turn that around, but I think the differences in what people are seeing clinically are represented in the literature, which is you're seeing much more prevalence of folks working with kids and doing a lot of really good research with kids, and that adult representation side is still in the growth process.
Let's be honest, most CEU events could use a little more sun and a lot more fun. That's why ABA Con at Sea was imagined, a CEU cruise conference for BCBAs who want more from their continuing education than fluorescent lights and cold coffee. From February 16th through 20th, 2026, we're hitting the high seas aboard Royal Caribbean's Wonder of the Seas, with stops in tropical Nassau and Coco Cay. Earn up to 12 CEUs, including ethics and supervision credits, and join sessions led by expert presenters on topics like travel accessibility, habit formation, leadership skills, executive functioning, and more. This isn't your typical CEU event. It's your professional development gateway. Sign up and book your cabin now at goabacon.com. Come join the adventure. That's goabacon.com. We'll see you there. A lot of good points there. I think one thing I would also say is that it's probably easier to do, there's probably more infrastructure to do clinical research for children than there might be for adult services. That's speculation on my part, but yeah, it's an important supporting adults in the way in which you and your colleagues are doing is going to be an ever increasingly important thing that the field needs to get up to speed on. To your point, let's fast forward 15 years, all these learners with autism, they're going to be young kiddos are going to be adults with autism with their own unique needs and things like that. So again, I very much appreciate the work you do. And I worked in adult services for a little bit when I first moved back to New England 20 years ago. I've been doing more school consultation, but early on when I moved back here, it was eye-opening, certainly, about how all the issues that you have to support people with. So one of the challenges I think too is the residential side of things. And we are, just to kind of speak directly to the audience, we are getting to the paper here. So bear with me. This is going somewhere. But supporting individuals in the residential setting, very often in group home settings. We'll get into the specific intervention that you guys carried out as it relates to data collection. But can you speak just on a more general level about the challenges of operating a group home? To me, it's like the hardest job in the world, having peeked into that universe at various points in my career. There's so many different challenges that come along with those settings. So can you highlight at least some of those so people can get an appreciation as to why this work is so important?
Oh, absolutely, and it's for a lot of people, that may not realize Missouri, in terms of its Department of Mental Health and its intellectual and developmental disability divisions, are really advanced compared to other states, and so the state of Missouri is doing away with group homes. There's no more designation. They're all now ISLs, or individualized supported living environments. And so typically you look at group home as 8 or more people. I really look at group home as anything more than, maybe, let's say, 4 people. Most of our homes have 3 or 4 clients in them. They have their own bedroom, and, I'm getting to see this from the ground up now, which I appreciate it more, because in this role, as we're starting up, I am interviewing DSPs, and I'm kinda going through the process and have the questions of whatever, 30. I think I just started my 36th year of adult services, and so all those 36 years, 35 plus, I've got, questions of staff, that I ask them, "Hey, if you have a staff member that is, saying, 'Hey, it's okay if we take a short nap on the overnight or during the evening,' how do you respond to that? How do you respond to peer pressure on the job?" And then kind of pointing to the paper a little bit too, how do you respond when you say, "Oh, John wants us to do that paperwork and that data collection stuff, but it's not really important. What's important is cooking the meals and those kind of things." So I think the number one issue is finding good people that wanna do this work, and there are a lot of people that I'm finding now that, truly have a passion for it and a love for it, and you can sift through some of those individuals as you go through the interview process, but I think what makes it, as you stated, one of the hardest jobs in the world is that, you're going through and you're working at different shifts. Our organization, we have certain guidelines about what shifts you can work and how many hours. I've worked at places in the past where it wasn't unusual for a direct support staff to work 90 to 105 hours a week. And so it's crazy, but some of those places you can actually look at their 990s and you can see a DSP as their leading wage earner in a lot of these organizations. So that's one thing to kind of look at. How do you measure burnout? And we talk a lot about this in the book. How do you then put things in place to make sure that staff that are having the burnout can address that? But the number one thing overarching for all this is that most of the organizations where I've worked prior to this, and I'm sure, Matt, you've gone through this, and many individuals that have done adult services that have been on your show will nod their head, or they're nodding their head now when I say that the biggest issue is the clash between the residential side and the behavioral side. Behavior analyst comes in and says, "Hey, you need to collect data," or, "I've noticed that his behavioral incentive program is blank the last 3 days." And you may not get this face to face, but there's then the state, "Well, you're not my boss. You don't supervise me." So on purpose, what we've done here is my director that oversees all the residential, our director that oversees all the residential, she has a master's in applied behavior analysis. So she can understand that when requests are being made, that she's not taking the residential side versus the behavioral. She understands the behavioral. From a direct support perspective, there's a lot of times that schism between residential and behavioral. So our direct support professionals and crisis technicians, they are co-supervised by RBTs and behavior analysts, so that when an issue comes up, if somebody's not using the plan or whatever, their performance appraisal includes items that are just as behavioral as there are items for cooking and cleaning and making the beds and all these other things that happen. So I think that's the biggest piece, is that a lot of our staff that come in at the direct support level that may work in a group residential setting, they may have come from a place where they worked in retail, or they flipped burgers, or they did something that was totally opposite of this. Now they're in charge of human lives for an 8-hour shift, and it's a really, really huge undertaking for a lot of people. So that's why the book, and that's why the data collection paper, to kind of show that behavior analysis can help inform some interventions here, because there's just a lot that's out there that you walk into when you walk into a group home setting. So, we make it a point, behavior analysts, we're great with task analysis and checklists. So the van that goes with the group home or the residential facility, we have a checklist, and I tell our staff that van needs to look like your van at home. Okay, it's with the facility, but making sure that, if you want your kids safe in your van, you need to make sure our clients are safe. And also the home. The home needs to look like your home. And I think many times that pride is not there. So we've made it a point where BCBAs and RBTs are in the home the majority of at least the day shift, 7 to 3 p.m. And then 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., the evening shift, we also make it pretty heavy with behavioral staff because we want to be able to give that feedback and that guidance to kind of use OBM skills. Because I think that's one of the things that Peter Sturmey and Dennis Reed talked about years ago. I can remember I was thinking about in anticipation of today. I was thinking yesterday about how I could remember in grad school, Dr. Roger Poppin was my advisor, and we used to have Friday seminars, and they would invite guests from time to time. But I remember Dennis Reed came in one time in late 80s, and he talked to us about staff training, and that was before OBM was a thing in the field. And I thought, wow, this is what we need, because at that point I worked at a brain injury facility as a direct support staff as I was going through grad school. And I thought, man, people need to read this guy's work. And that was my first exposure to OBM and what that should look like and could look like in a residential setting. And that's what we've tried to do. That's where a lot of the stuff comes from, is from a lot of Dennis Reed's early work.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here and talk about Behavior University. As I mentioned at the outset, they have lots of courses. Whether you need an RBT course or a supervision course, they have you covered. They've got lots of on-demand CEUs, but I always like to talk about their live webinars, and they are always curating amazing topics with fascinating speakers. There's a couple coming up that I'd like to draw your attention to. There's two on instructional design and instructional delivery by Amy Evans. Amy's been on the podcast before. She's amazing. Those are going to be great. There's another one called Inspiring Flexible Eating in Children with Food Selectivity. And let's see, there's another one here that looks really cool. Achieving Long-Term Successful Outcomes for Children with Autism. Now, you're going to want to book these in your calendar right away. So go to behavioruniversity.com, look for the live webinars, and sign up for them, because what happens is they sell out. In fact, there's one that looks fascinating that's coming up in August, but it's sold out. So you're going to want to go to behavioruniversity.com. Again, look for the live webinars, find something you like, sign up for it and check it out. And yeah, they've got, again, a lot of other cool stuff there. If you need links, they'll be waiting for you in the show notes of this episode. Okay, let's get back to the conversation with John. Yeah, Reed and Parsons, they've authored a number of really good books. One of the books my boss gave it to me 25 plus years ago, called Motivating Human Service Staff.
Love that one.
And the first chapter, Denny lays out the staffing challenge that you just described in terms of how people arrive to these human service settings having not, and this is not a fault of theirs or anything like that, but these are entry-level positions, essentially. It's not that they've gone to school to become a direct service professional or something like that, like you would to become an engineer or a teacher or, a physical therapist or anything like that. These are entry-level jobs, and people may have come from other entry-level jobs, and that just presents a unique set of challenges from a staffing and management standpoint. And that first chapter of that particular book it's a pretty unflinching look at it. But it's definitely worth reading. I have a note in my notebook here to include a link to that in the show notes for this episode as well. And I'll just say parenthetically here, to the listeners, if you're not on the email list, this is not a plug or anything like that. It's just this will make your life easier. Get on the Behavioral Observations email list. You'll get all the show notes sent directly to you. So I've said that. I'll put that aside for a minute. Let's get to the paper. So again, the paper is Blending Staff Preference Assessments and Contingent Reinforcement to Enhance Data Collection in a Residential Facility for Adults with Severe Aggressive Behavior. So anytime someone comes on the show and they've got some work that they've produced, whether it's a book, a paper, a course, or what have you, I always ask them, hey, what was the motivation behind this? Why did you do this? Obviously, this one seems a little bit on the obvious side. It sounds like you weren't getting behavioral data But was there more to it than that? What were there other challenges that you were trying to wrestle with, or problems that you were trying to solve?
Well, I think that, some listeners may say, "Wait a minute, you've written the same article twice." No, we've done 2 or 3 articles that are in BAP and behavioral interventions on data collection behavior. And we had started out and, looking at a variety of things. And essentially, we find that whenever we go through the process, that a lot of direct support staff, whenever you go through your training, and I don't know, Matt, for school systems, there's a system out there called Therup, and there are a lot of other platforms where individuals can go in and type their clinical notes, and then it uploads to a system, and a case manager or a mom and dad or a teacher can all look at Billy's progress through Therup or through that app. So one of the things we were finding is that in our direct support notes, that many times I would see a staff member write down, Billy was, at the lunch table, and Joe walked by and slapped him on the back of the head, and Billy stepped up and then hit him in the jaw. And there's all this description of this physically aggressive episode, but then when I go to the behavioral data sheets, there's no documentation of that. And so, daily I get to go, as most supervisors do, and I know in school systems, you can look up the individual and you can see how their day went. And I do that before I go see clients. And I was noticing this, that I would see these write-ups, and then I would go and the individual, the data collection sheet just didn't show that anything had happened. So we had tried a couple of different interventions, and the first one that we looked at, we could look online, and then the baseline was pretty involved. We would have to go and we would read, and then we actually had to go through for each day. There's a narrative for the first shift, second shift, and third shift, and we had to do a correlation between the number of behavioral episodes that were described in the notes versus the number of episodes that were actually on the descriptive analysis data sheets. And we found 0 to 20% agreement on those. It just wasn't happening. So we had tried a couple of different interventions with this. One is, we had looked at trying to do preference assessments with staff, and then trying to, based on their preference assessments, they meet a certain level of data collection behavior, and they get a gas card or a card for Applebee's or whatever, so they can, have a meal with their family or something like that. And we got to those issues, but one of the things that we found is just with this latest paper is it was, the preference assessments are what helped. We've done papers in the past where we've looked at the individuals would engage in certain behavior, and we've used the different checklists, so we've kind of used the therapeutic skill checklist where we go through and kind of get from different areas, why is this behavior not occurring? And the performance diagnostic checklist for human services we've used in the past, where we could find out that if the individuals were not, they were receiving feedback on the job, they had training, but we found out that antecedent manipulations weren't in place. So we started texting the staff that were on shift, "Hey, remember to fill out your data collection forms before you leave." And we saw drastic increases in, the level of performance. And in this latest paper, we actually utilized the preference assessments. And so we had a person on each shift that was kind of the lead. And what we did is we provided, based on their preference assessments, reinforcers that were contingent upon them achieving certain levels. We would say 70% accuracy at first, and then 80, and then 90%. And I did. I had some administrators kind of call me out on that and say, "Well, okay, how are you funding this? How are you paying for these gas cards and all these other things?" Well, one of the biggest things, we had one home where we had a lot of property destruction, broken glass, broken tables. And so we were exceeding, $100,000, or I'm sorry, we were in six figures. So it was close to 90 to 100, $1,000 for some of these homes for drywall replacements, mirrors, microwaves, you name it. And we were replacing these things. So we were having tens of thousands of dollars, and sometimes numerous homes adding up to 100 plus. And I said, okay, you take $100,000, and we had reduced that particular home down to about maybe $8,000 to $10,000 in damage that year. I said, that's what pays for those gas cards. And really, it's only, I think we did the math, 0.001% of that savings is what it costs to have those cards in place. And so a lot of administrators, they look at that, because we've tried studies in the past where, if you improve your absence behavior or your tardiness behavior, then we'll give you a day off. But administrators say, well, you can't give free days off, or you can't, another pushback in agencies is, you can't give gas cards and food cards to staff because that's an extra earning, and that may put them in a different tax bracket, and those things are not taxed. So to the behavior analysts out there, you're going to run into a lot of administrative pushback. You just have to be creative, and that's what we did in this case, providing the reinforcers for staff. And then eventually, as we had to fade it, we just made it to where there was one staff per each home that was responsible for the data collection. So if it didn't occur, they were the ones that we could come to problem solve what was occurring or not occurring. So it's a lot of work in a lot of these homes. You find that as you take your spotlight off them and you work at other homes, the data collection behavior starts to slide a little bit. So that's where we wanted to try and put something in place that was as robust as possible, where existing staff had that as part of their job duties to maintain the data collection, because in many agencies, unless they're a behavioral agency like ours, data collection behavior gets kind of pushed under, swept under the rug, and things like having all your trainings up to date and your documentation where it needs to be and all the meals are cooked, all important things, but they don't give the behavior analysts in the organization an opportunity to have accurate data. So with accurate data in the homes that we worked in these studies, we were able to significantly reduce property destruction, go from, probably, six figures in some homes, way down to where we were looking at areas where we're maybe $4,000 or $5,000, which was a huge savings over the course of that year, which was great social validity for the intervention.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. It sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, I want to make sure I'm following the thread here accurately. So there was some documentation occurring because you'd see the narrative, the summary from the shift log.
Correct.
And that would tell you whether or not data were or weren't collected in the forms in which you wanted people to collect it.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Because that was a procedural question I had in the paper itself, in terms of I was like, okay, if the tree doesn't fall, or or if no one's there to hear I was trying to think of some tortured analogy of how would you know if data weren't collected? So how do you tell the misses from apart from the hits, as it were?
Right, exactly.
So okay, I get it. I'm with you now.
And it's because many times administrators and program supervisors are all over staff if you don't do a daily narrative and a note, because Department of Mental Health in a lot of waiver systems in Medicaid, that's how you get paid, that note for that shift. But as a result of that, that is emphasized, and there's not a lot of emphasis placed on the data collection on the data sheets that we can appreciate as a profession.
I had another thought about that as you were laying the whole conundrum out. There are hierarchies of importance that systems like these place on not just collecting data, but also elements of procedural implementation. Again, going way back in my history of residential services, if you screw up, you know, recording a medication a certain way, or even worse, med administration and the 6 routes, all those things,
Exactly.
like you won't be in a job that long if you bugger that stuff up. And so there's a premium on certain forms of information and less so on others. So is that basically what's happening? What was happening in your setting?
It's exactly what was happening, and the study actually led to a permanent policy that was put in place, is that, for some direct support staff, if they get a yearly incentive, there's certain things that are, based on that. Zero med errors or blah, blah, all those things that we look at, but also now we look at that at least 80% on your data collection behavior. And that goes, so, oh, okay, wow, that impacts my performance appraisal, that impacts my bonus. So I'm going to focus more on that behavior. But you're exactly right. Those things are, we've got a staff training going on right now. We've got two of our awesome staff from Springfield up to train our new St. Louis group that we've got. We have staff trainings go through every couple of weeks. But they're doing med administration, they're doing all these other things, and those checks, it's a big deal. Everybody in this office hears about a med error, but a behavioral data collection error, nobody hears about it except the behavior analyst, and nobody seems to care. So that's what we're trying to correct here and make it to where it's all part of the performance or the behavioral expectations of the direct support staff.
So I have another kind of in the weeds question here. I'm thinking about response effort as it relates to collecting data. So I'm imagining, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that making a reference to a behavioral incident in the shift log has lower response effort than documenting a behavioral event. I mean, and I guess while we're chatting here, tell us the specific type of data collection format that you have. What sorts of information are you prompting staff to feed into the system?
I'll say up front on this, it can be intimidating when you look at it because it's a descriptive analysis data sheet. So, you would put the date, the time the episode started, and then the time the episode would end, okay, to get your duration measure. Then also you would have an antecedent, and you also would have the client's response to feedback. Did they take your feedback well and calm down, or did they resist and continue to display problem behavior? Location codes. So there's a lot of little boxes to check. So there is a little bit of a response expectation for staff, whereas it might be a little bit easier, as some staff would say that, today Joey was clowning and had an issue with so-and-so, which we see a lot of that. And so we now have incorporated into our staff training before they hit the floor. Use descriptive language, describe what clowning means, or if somebody is off the chain, let's not use that term. Let's describe what it happens. And my favorite all time is, Sally had a great day, no behavior. It's like, oh God,
No,
Sally.
yeah, it's like let's
Yeah.
check our pulse.
Yeah, Sally's dead. So to understand, do it and describe it. And I tell our staff, describe it just like I'm there. The table went over. There was a loud, crash. And then he took the chair and threw it through the window and whatever happened. And so I think that that's probably where that comes in, where we try to kind of instruct staff. But there is a little bit of an expectation. So as you go through, then the RBT or whoever's in the home would then take that data and plug that into the data sheet. So we actually utilize most of our data we do is in Excel. And so we have protected folders that we use that we all can see, that we kind of go through. So I could kind of open up a folder right now. And let's say I had a funder that was asking me, hey, how was Joey's hygiene last week? Or we've got one young man that when he gets frustrated, he's punch himself in the face repeatedly. How many times have we had that self-injurious behavior? I can go and I can look it up and I can see kind of online. but it's through a lot of the description of, hey, as you're doing this. And another thing too, it's old school, but I prefer paper and pencil, the data collection sheets of, I mean, Therup has got some options where you can put in, but it's not nearly as detailed as, okay, here's the antecedent, here's the response to feedback. What are we looking at in terms of, did the person use self-management? Did it take a lot of prompting? Those types of things, so that you can type your note, but then also at the same time, put it on the written format. But 9 times out of 10, that's where I see the error. If they're going to engage in a behavior, it's going to be, I'm going to put it in my note because I get more feedback on that than if I don't do it on the written portion on the data form itself. So data form is both a frequency, duration, and it's got intensity measures. So we're looking at a lot of, it's a lot more complex than just an ABC analysis, but I'd like to know, how intense, if he punched himself in the nose, well, was his nose bleeding, or, was it a light tap? So we can kind of get an idea, and then we can reinforce decreasing levels of intensity if the frequency stays the same.
I have a feeling that after this podcast, you're going to get a lot of phone calls from various tech-oriented ABA companies to see where
Well, I won't mention, but I've tried a few of them, and I've tried to say, "Hey, I want you to put this in there," and it's been tough. So if there's some way, that would be great, because I'd always tell the story that we tried a popular brand a few years ago on the phone, and very simple. All staff had to do is put in their staff number plus a 0 to get in, and then record data. And it even had different ways you could record video, and it was encrypted and it was HIPAA compliant. And we found we got less compliance with staff with digital data collection than we did paper and pencil.
Hmm.
And I don't know, my theory is that social media is a competing behavior with documentation, and you're on that same device, because the devices that we use in our homes now are Chromebooks, and everything outside of agency websites are blocked. You can't do anything but your data collection there, and that prevents surfing and all the other things that people could be doing. But that's my thing on the phone. I felt like maybe that there's just more of a tendency to go to that Facebook icon than it is to go to name your agency here, but to go to the home agency and put in the data. So yeah, that may be the case. We just haven't had success with that.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. So we have, I think a pretty solid foundation of what you were trying to accomplish, or at least an appreciation of the problem that you were trying to solve. Let's get into the specifics of the study itself. So how many people did you have as participants?
So we had, if you wanted to kind of generalize, we had probably 3 homes that had anywhere from 7 to 15 staff in each home. But the main individuals that we kind of looked at that we targeted with the incentives were the supervisors. So we had 3 supervisors in each of the homes that we targeted.
I see. And so they're the ones who are responsible ultimately for the collection and the management of behavioral data.
Right. To kind of make sure and kind of look at the documentation. Does the documentation in the notes match the documentation on the forms in the home? And, and if that's the case, also, they had a lot of the oversight that took place there. But, primarily, I think from a social validity level, I think it impacted, any of those 7 to 15 staff. So if you're looking at that, probably 45 staff over the 3 homes that, actually got the feedback, and that we would kind of say, all right, it looks like from today you haven't really reported or recorded your, the data that are here. So I think the wider impact was close to that number of staff, because I think that, if somebody's looking to replicate the paper, I think it's a great way to be able to look at how you could impact a larger number of staff with just something as simple as a basic reinforcement procedure. And sometimes, as we've done in the past, even a prompting procedure, because many of us as behavior analysts, we get so busy that we don't really get down to the point where we prompt our staff every shift and say, hey, have you collected data? And then it becomes one shift becomes two, and then two becomes three, and then it becomes 1 day, 2 days. And next thing you know, you've got a week where you haven't had your relevant data collected.
I see. So the incentives, they were applied to the 3 supervisors, but the supervisors then
Correct.
okay, all right, got it. So the dependent variable was like documented, events documented or something like that?
Dependent variable that we had was what we called a percent agreement. So we actually looked at the percentage agreement that we had from the documentation in the notes, and the way that we actually compared that to the documentation in the notes versus documentation on the forms themselves.
I see. And just to give listeners an idea of the scope of the problem, where when you conducted the baseline measures about where, and again, I'll put a link to the paper and show notes so people can look it up for themselves. I'm not going to ask you to chart the specific numbers here because I know they'll put you on the spot. But just in general, where in terms of percent agreement, and I'm sure there was variability across the participants here, but give us a sense of the scope of the problem. How bad or good was the data collection prior to the intervention?
0 to 15% agreement. It was
Okay.
that challenged.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So in terms of that you would see maybe 1 out of every 10 episodes were actually written on the data sheet.
I
Uh,
see.
and they were, doing well, putting them in the documentation, but not transferring it over. And so, like I mentioned, with some of the previous studies that we had done, we kind of had looked at other areas and kind of had looked at performance diagnostic checklist to identify. And so we had, seen that in the past. But here, one of the main things that we were looking at is, okay, so maybe we don't have the motivation or reinforcement, of the supervisors to be able to go through. And so once they were acknowledged and reinforced, then, they kind of changed their behavior to make sure that that agreement increased. So we were over 90% in most of actually in every single home after we had put the intervention in place.
Okay. And I know you walked us through this a few minutes ago, but just to summarize, so you basically offered a menu of reinforcers, rewards, or whatever you want to call them, incentives, and people were able to select the ones that they felt were most meaningful to them. Is that
Right, right, and we did it digitally, so we actually had a PowerPoint, and so the staff can go through and kinda do their 5-item MSWO, and so the program on PowerPoint would go through, they'd select one, then remove that, and then we got a hierarchy, whether it would be, the gas cards, or if it was a food card, or if it was, some other type of, a card for Baskin Robbins, that they go out and kinda do something they got as a result of the data collection in that home being at a certain level. And that was based on, and each staff person had differed. For one staff it's gas, and for another person, it could be food, or it could be iTunes. It could be a variety of things. We had one staff, I think, that on the preference assessment, they actually wanted to 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 have something where they had a credit card for their favorite airline, because they had family that they had to travel to see, and so it didn't make a huge impact, because their family was, it was like an 8-hour flight to get there, but they went there pretty regularly, and so whether it's something for a free checked bag or something like that. So, but at that point we realized, and R.B. Daniels talks about it a lot in his performance management book, that many times we provide reinforcers that are based on what we think the staff will like. And I did this years ago. I used to use, gear, although, this is my Ryder Cup shirt, and this is highly reinforcing to me. But for some people, we give agency. So let's say we work at Easter Seals and we give them an Easter Seal shirt. Well, we had an RBT at one time that we had a thing. We'd give them company gear for the highest billing RBT every month. Well, we did that, and I found out that the gal that won it the first month, she quit the next month. So obviously that told me that gear. So here we thought, okay, preference assessment is going to give us an idea of exactly what they like, because many times we do try to reinforce with things that we would like that our staff don't, and that's as good as just not acknowledging anybody, period, if you give them something they don't prefer.
Or worse, and there's a lot of memes about this, but the generic pizza party,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
um,
exactly. There's and this kind of relates to our mutual interest in jam bands, but, I remember years ago seeing a gentleman. He now heads up what's called DSP University, and basically it's the direct support staff clearinghouse. It is the College of Direct Support, I believe, is Joseph Macbeth, I think is his name. And we were at a conference at one time, and he was speaking, and I had my computer, and I was in the front row, and I had a Grateful Dead sticker on my computer. And he came and he started talking, and as he's giving his talk, he said, "Yeah," he said, "when I was a direct support professional," he said, "there were all my clients that didn't have clothes. I would go to thrift shops and I'd get them Grateful Dead shirts. And I didn't realize that was something I liked that they may not like, and I didn't ask them." Although I can't imagine anybody that wouldn't like a Grateful Dead shirt, but I guess those people do exist at certain points in the world. But specificity, I think, is the thing. Being able to find out what reinforces you, because that attaboy and the pizza parties, those are memes that are out there that I think are pretty tired, and people are looking for things more individualized these days.
I, I'm not sure if you can speak to this or not, but so if the supervisors were the ones who were directly participating and earning as it relates to this program, and we have to assume that because the data collection improved, they're placing more emphasis about collecting data on the part of their supervisees. Was there any resentment, if the from the non-supervisory staff? Well, you're doing this now because you're going to get a gas card or something like that. Did you run into any of that?
It's great because we worried about that at first, because we made sure to pick 3 homes that there was no overlap in staff, so that we didn't have, Johnny at home A saying, "Hey man, and he works at this second home. If you do better here, they give you gas cards." So we wouldn't have a confound. And so we tried to make it to where there was not a lot of that, oversight inside communication and those things that were going on. So we tried, as a result of that we would even kind of, try and deliver more verbal praise for the staff that were doing that. But there wasn't a lot of pushback. Now, there were some comments. Yeah, you're exactly right there. It's like, "Hey, I filled out my data form last night. Where's my my golf card or my gas card," and some things like that. But it wasn't to the tipping point of where the animosity had a negative effect on the impact that we had.
Okay, all right. Um,
Right.
yeah. So looking at the data, the impact was pretty instantaneous for the most part. That was very noticeable and noteworthy. So given its success and given the ROI that I think I now appreciate that you've talked about earlier on in this discussion in terms of like less damage to the home. And, you have to imagine too that there's collateral positive effects if staff, you know, aren't having to manage severe behaviors frequently and things along those lines. Are you agency wide scaling this right now, or what's the future of a practice like this?
Well, what this led us to in terms of generalization or maintenance of the gains and generalization across homes is that we had to have an individual that we kind of put in charge of this. So, because initially we found out that we had individuals that would say, "Hey, that second shift, I didn't do that." So we had to make sure that there was to include data collection in the job duties of these staff. So they can't say, "Well, that's a different shift," or "That's not me." So we've made it to where it's a general job expectation, but then also made it to the point where we started looking at and having in one of our other studies Because as we're talking, I know a lot of times I'm blending them in my brain. Okay, was this the one with the preference assessment? And the other one was with the prompting we did via text messages. But one of the things that we found out throughout both studies that we've done with data collection is that as we're looking at these things, we're looking at the interventions, you have to make one person responsible because otherwise you have, diffuse responsibility and people tend to pass the buck. And then the other one is that you have to really heighten the expectation on the point of your behavior analysts. So that as they're in the home, they're continually prompting and you have an increased presence in the home to kind of remind the staff, how important this is and what this is, and a lot of times to me, I make it just part of my interaction style with the staff because, one of the biggest things that's in the staff training book is talking about we need to respect, I know, you talked to D2 and others around trauma and ABA and it's great, but our focus is on trauma with the staff and our staff trauma and looking at that. And there's a portion of that I call set point, staff experiential trauma. So be on the lookout for that. I'm having initial discussions with Dr. Karen Harvey. And she is I believe, clinical psychologist and probably is the foremost expert out there on trauma in individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so she wrote a great book a little while back on behavior plan completion from a trauma perspective. And so her main premise is that we're ignoring trauma and we're writing behavior plans based on compliance as opposed to respecting trauma. And so we're talking about, actually a little bit later this week, we're talking about writing a book related to trauma and direct support staff and how do we address that. And so with a lot of our staff, this whole idea of staff experiential trauma, that leads staff to where if they are being targeted verbally, physically, sexually, whatever at work by those that they work for and with, then they're going to be less likely to collect data or less like they're going to maybe turn over and leave quicker than we want them to. So we have to look at how do we incorporate different things like training for resilience. We have trainings that we do for our staff every month called TCS, Therapeutic Communication Skills. And the book has a great curriculum guide to how to do this if you want to do these on your own. So the TCS are 2-day trainings, and we teach staff, okay, what should you eat? How do you exercise? How do you work exercise into your, I found out for me, it's not the thing, to work out in the morning. So I do it after work. So we talk to staff about here are things that you could benefit from eating and look at the amount of sleep that you get. All these things that can actually help data collection behavior and all these other issues, but just by addressing the trauma that goes along with it. Because the preferences that we saw in the behavioral data collection studies, the preferences were indicative of the traumatic lifestyle some of our staff have. Maybe not having enough gas to get across town where sometimes we take that for granted, or maybe not having enough money for put food on the table that night, and the food card helps for that. So I think that if we're able to do that and have that focus, that has helped us to institute that trauma-based training for our staff to take what we found in these studies and move it forward to make sure that we can kind of maintain and generalize what we've seen in studies related to enhancing data collection behavior by the staff.
And I'm sorry, what was the name of that colleague you referenced?
Dr. Karen Harvey. She spells her first name Karyn Harvey.
Great. And what was the name of the book?
It was Trauma Informed Behavioral Programs. And if you just plug in on Amazon, Karen Harvey and trauma and behavioral programming or behavior plans, it'll pop up.
Okay, I'll find the link to that. Put that in the notes also.
Very useful as a behavior analyst to be able to hear this feedback from someone that works with behavior analysts, but is looking at it through a trauma-focused lens for both client and staff. But her work is mainly with the clients, and she just has case study after case study where she points to unsuccessful behavioral programs, and then the trauma portion is addressed, and problem behavior goes away. So very interesting.
All right. I'll definitely have to check that out. Appreciate that. Were there any other kind of anecdotal observations from the study that didn't make it into the paper that you were like, oh, that's interesting? And maybe, the information maybe wasn't robust enough to report in a scientific journal, but maybe have, spurred some thinking in a particular direction, or was an aha moment or anything like that. Anything come to mind?
It's one of the things that didn't make it to the paper, but is in the book, and it's been the foundation of our managerial training program. So we have a program that we found as we're looking through this, and essentially we looked at, okay, though it wasn't really a component of our data collection studies that we had done over the last few years, we found that a lot of the approaches, whether it's texting staff to remind them to collect data, or giving changing criteria and trying to look at matching your notes, that it was behavioral skills training, because we were going through, we were giving feedback, we were then kind of modeling the behavior we were looking for, and then we would observe, and then we would give more feedback, and we continue to do that. So we have a managerial training program now that also is described in the book about how you can do this on your own, where we have each BCBA takes on as a mentee. They're a mentor, and they have a residential director. Typically, it's a residential manager that they mentor for. And so they go through, and the residential person, and usually in this portion of our field, you have a residential manager or program supervisor. They have staff meetings every month. And so behavior analyst goes in, they model, here's the data collection sheet. Here's how you should fill it out. Here's how this needs to match what you're writing in your notes. They would go through, describe it, model it, observe. And so the process in our managerial training is the managers observe this, and then the next month, they provide the same training on the same material based on what they observe the BCBA do, and they get feedback on it, and then they progress to the next step. So from behavioral data collection to interaction style to facilitation of behavior support plans, all these other things in a behavioral skills training model, with the idea, and we've seen this a lot, that if the manager is teaching the same stuff and is on the same page as the behavior analyst, staff's ears perk up when my manager or my director says something. And then when John and his team start talking, they either snooze or they do something else. Typically and I'm sure we've all done it. You look around, you're doing behavior support plan training, people are not on the edge of their seats, they're just ready. So this way, the manager, my director is now talking this and saying it's important, so it must be important. And so we have incorporated that to where now, if the manager is having a problem, they know to go to, let's say, Julie, who is our BCBA that might do this, or our lead RBT. And so that was something that really kind of came about because through our methodology, in neither of these studies did we do something where we called it behavioral skills training and went through, but in the combination of the two, that's exactly what we did. So from a rigor perspective, it wouldn't have met the criteria for an explicit variable that we were looking at, or independent variable. But as we went through, the general nature of it and then walking people through the process is producing results, because we find that the managers now have somebody they can lean on if they have behavioral questions, and there's kind of an advocate for them. So that took it to that next level, so to speak.
You mentioned earlier that you were able to, for lack of a better word, sell this to the administration because of the savings, both, in terms of the maintenance of and upkeep of the households and, some of these other, again, collateral benefits that you just described. Are there, if someone's listening to this and they're trying to pitch this to their administrative staff, those are two very important things that I think are worth mentioning. What else would you advise someone to maybe talk up if they're looking at this and say, trying to say to their, board of directors or whatever, hey, we're having a problem with X. Here's something in the literature that looks like it, had very, very fast, immediate effects with lots of good stuff that came along for the ride, unprogrammed wise, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, what would you say to that person?
Well, I think I'm going to bring up a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Paulie Gavoni. Okay, and we
I was on a call with Polly this morning.
Yes, well, we are I have a paper right here that we're working on, positive behavioral leadership, and that's what I would do. We were using, his 4-term contingency and kind of the managerial hats. So if anybody's, familiar with that, I'm I'm actually giving him the shout out now on the positional authority book. Positional authority, ain't leadership, but I think that's the aspect of it. The use of positive reinforcement in leadership is that if you're going through and you're having that pushback, that maybe having that conversation with your supervisor, your manager about, hey, there's this thing within our field and it's called OBM. And it's a little bit like, and you have to find, because most program folks that are administrators, they either have an MBA and a background similar to that, or they're a money person. And so they have experience with what we all have experienced in industrial organizational psychology that OBM is kind of the counterpart to. And so I think that would be the aspect of it as well. Other things that I've had notes here that I wanted to throw these in, but it's I loved it when you talked to John Austin about results, and that book is fantastic, and it tells you how to speak to those that many times I've found as behavior analysts that I've had to answer to, bosses that maybe had business background. And in Dr. Austin's results book, he recommends, and I cannot recommend this book more highly, The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. And if you've never heard of psychological flexibility, that's what that book is all about. And that's what we try to build in our organizations and try to talk to our administrators about. That if you have something, like today, if I have a behavior analyst walk in and say, hey, John, that data collection sheet that you have sucks. I think we need to add this, this, and this, and it'd be easier for staff, and that they have the opening to do that. Whereas most organizations, you say that and you're canned, you're out the door. But psychologically safe, and John Austin's book Results introduced me to that term, psychological flexibility, and I now have an hour talk that I do on it. But it's the safety to be able to come to your workplace and to be able to share an idea that you think is going to improve what your job is, and to use an OBM lens, but that people don't have a fear of speaking up. That you don't have a fear-based organization. And so that's the name of her book, The Fearless Organization. But I just think that to kind of say, hey, as behavior analysts, if to really study up on your OBM and then share with your administrative folks that, hey, I can speak your language too, and our field is called OBM, and here's what that looks like from a behavioral perspective. And then looking at that, and I mean, you don't have to get right to the money stuff, but ours in the savings and property destruction showed that.
If you're in the nonprofit world, then that speaks volumes for sure.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And look at, for each new hire, I think we spend, most organizations spend $2,000 to $3,000. Our new hire group that's in there now, we've got about 12 new hires. They're going through 2 weeks of training, and that's 80 hours. And if you put the numbers to that, that's easily $2 to $3,000 if you turn over and you have to rehire that spot. But if you can show psychological flexibility and you can do some of these things that we have found in these studies to foster that engagement, then, it's a winner. So I think those are and positive leadership. That's why, Paulie and I were talking about this, and you probably have a copy coming your way, Matt. We're looking for feedback. And Nick Weatherly, we're sending a copy out as well. But I think it's one of the things that every year in my OBM class, I give students a chore and say, listen, I'll give you 7 points on your final if you can find a behavior analytically oriented article on positive reinforcement based leadership this within the last 10 or 15 years, because most of these articles were written in the 70s, or they were things that were written in books that R.B. Daniels, but no real peer reviewed articles that are out there. So Paulie and I started talking and said, okay, we need to fill that void and look at that. So that's kind of the next steps that we're looking to do that. But I think that's the biggest thing. If you have a psychologically safe environment, then you as a behavior analyst can go in and talk to the accountant or the MBA and not feel like you're going to be shut out or have their eyes rolled at you.
All very good points. As we wrap up here, John, I want to, I'd like to broaden this out a little bit. And you've made a career of doing some of these, kind of applied research, studies, right? And I think most of us in practice don't see ourselves as researchers, or at least I'm just maybe okay. I'll just say it from my own perspective. I don't see myself as a researcher, and but if someone was interested in doing something like this study, or had an experimental question they want to answer in their own organization, but didn't, kind of, you know, maybe I don't know. What advice would you have for someone who is interested in not just solving some of these problems, but looking at it from a real empirical lens, possibly with the goal of sharing it with the broader community through journal publication or what have you?
I think the first thing that we try, Matt, is to really make sure that when we look at something and we put an intervention in place, I mean, we're about to start something, that we make sure that, we're not, faced with a number of confounds. Okay. So as we're going through and, let's say you're looking at something at the organizational level like this, that, we look at, at the same time, this would have made no sense, for us to do this study if at the same time staff are getting raises or there's staff moving in between homes. So a lot of times, a lot of these studies have turned up from, we've got one now where we use the good behavior game, but we've used it with adults, and that might be a future episode. But we've
Oh,
got
yeah.
on the good behavior game that we've used with adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities and had phenomenal results. So we were looking at this, and we had just naturally 3 different groups that we were doing this with, and we were doing simple behaviors, absence of interruption behavior, raising your hand, being acknowledged by your name before you speak out, and just looking at the behavioral changes in a multiple baseline and saying, you know what, that could be an article. And the other thing I'd recommend is get a hold of Dennis Reed's paper in JABA, The Scientist Practitioner. And that's a good approximation to the title. I'm going to get you the actual title, Matt, after this. But he did a great paper in JABA that showed how he and a lot of his co-writers, I think Carolyn Green and a lot of others that Dennis Reed has published with Parsons. And basically he shows and writes about how that he as a practitioner had to take advantage of all the research opportunities at his place of business and where he worked. But he gives recommendations that not only should that be something that, that we strive for, but it should be something that we emphasize. And he gives you some bulleted steps on how to do that if that's what you're interested in doing, to do a little research at your day job, so to speak. Great article.
All right. I'll have to check that out. Again, if you send me the reference, that will go in the show notes too. John, I could keep asking you questions all morning here, but we, unfortunately, we got to call it a day at some point or another. So
I hear you.
So that just means we'll have to have you come on again, and we won't wait 3 years to do it. In this case,
Yeah.
you must know. Someone must have told you, hey, if you mention the good behavior game, that'll really get mass attention. So anyway, so always fun chatting with you. Really appreciate the chance to pick your brain about this topic. Congrats on the paper. Congrats on the book, the course. A lot of cool things going on. And thanks for stopping by and sharing all of that stuff with us.
It's always a pleasure, Matt. Thanks again, man.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.